This is an image of war from Vietnam. This child, burned by napalm, is the focus of television and press cameras. What is the role of the media in wartime? Is it simply to record, or is it to explain, and from whose point of view? The military, the politicians, or the victims?
One of the heaviest weeks in Vietnam. General, how would you assess yesterday's activities in the embassy? What is the enemy trying to get the target?
Straight from the Joint Chiefs of Command, high-ranking South Vietnamese.
This is the common face of war. Atrocity, indignity, suffering, inhuman squalor as a life ebbs away in mud. But apart from those who were there, who suffered, the images of war remembered and celebrated are often far removed from the squalor and as such are acceptable. Lists of names in splendid marble, moving ceremonies at the homecoming, and a large, ugly box bearing the remains of wasted young men, disguised by the bright colours, not of life, but of a symbol used to rationalise war, a flag. In the summer of 1854, the editor of the Times received an urgent message from one of his foreign correspondents, an Irishman called William Howard Russell. "Am I to tell these things or to hold my tongue?" wrote Russell, to which his editor, John Delane, replied that he should go ahead and tell the truth. It was a rare moment of glory in the history of war reporting. Russell was the Times man at the Crimea, a war which Queen Victoria described as popular beyond belief. It certainly wasn't that after Russell had got through with it. He reported the charge of the Light Brigade as the disaster it was. He reported the waste and the blunders and the carnage of the whole British adventure. A government fell because of what he wrote. The establishment grew to hate him, and Prince Albert called him a miserable scribbler. According to his epitaph in St. Paul's Cathedral, Russell was the first and the greatest war correspondent. Whether or not he was that, his readers certainly got the facts of war faster in the age of the horse than you, the television viewing public, got the facts of the Falklands War in the age of the computer and the satellite. And of course the truth of that war is still coming in. Indeed, the Crimea was the last British war before censorship. This film is about the reporting of truth in wartime, an important subject because it can often determine how those who govern us can justify other wars, regardless of the lessons of history. Before the Crimea, the military reported its own wars, with generals informing the public of their great deeds, often months after a battle was won or lost. Wellington, for example, reported Waterloo.
The Times then experimented with hiring a junior officer, but that didn't work either, much the same reason. And then, 1852, they decided the thing to do was to send a civilian for the first time. And of course the army hated it.
Russell described himself as the miserable parent of a luckless tribe, the tribe being war correspondents. He wrote in a deeply personal style. He didn't aspire to objectivity as a holy grail to be worshipped at all cost. He wrote the truth as he saw it. He described the brutal neglect of ordinary British soldiers. He described the absurd privilege of officers and their entourage of wives, chefs, and gentlemen friends there to watch the war as they would a cricket match. He accused the expedition and its leader, Lord Raglan, of incompetence, ignorance, blunders, folly. General Sir George Brown would physically shudder at the very mention of the Times. And not surprisingly, Russell was called a traitor, which of course he was not. Like so many of the luckless tribe, he never questioned the war itself or the institution of war. The advent of the telegraph during the American Civil War changed almost everything. Now it was possible to get news straight from the front, and the first circulation battles were based on war stories, any war stories. The editor of the Chicago Times sent this message to his reporter: "Telegraph fully all news you can get, and when you can't get news, send rumors."
If you were a general, you rapidly learnt that you could buy a war correspondent for $50. If you were an artillery officer and you wanted to advance your career, then $50 would get you a war correspondent who would say that you were the best artillery officer in the whole of the Union Army.
Instant hero.
Instant hero.
Had censorship begun then?
No, you could write what you liked. There was no possibility of censoring you anyway, because immediate access to the telegraph meant that the story was in the papers before the generals knew what you'd written.
A few, but only a few, reported the bloody futility. Ned Spencer of the Cincinnati Times made no name for himself when he wrote, "As I sit tonight writing this epistle, the dead are all around me. The knife of the surgeon is busy at work, and amputated legs and arms lie scattered in every direction. I hope my eyes may never again look upon such sights." There are two divisions in the world, wrote Kipling, Germans and human beings. The First World War had begun. Life was so cheap that the Daily Mail in 1915 gave only a few lines to the latest casualty figures from Germany: 2.75 million dead. The great American crusading journalist I.F. Stone once wrote, "All governments are liars, and nothing they say should be believed." He exaggerated, though I wonder by how much. World War I is a prime example. It was the big lie. There was a deliberate state-run conspiracy to lie to the British people about the futility of the war and its carnage. But what was significant was the extent to which the press and the reporters themselves took part in the conspiracy. Philip Gibbs was war correspondent of the Daily Chronicle. He later became Sir Philip Gibbs, knighted by a grateful establishment. "We wrote the truth," said Gibbs, "apart from the naked realism of horrors and losses and criticism of the facts, which did not come within the liberty of our pen." In other words, Gibbs was admitting that the correspondents wrote not what they knew to be true, but what they were told was true. There was no need for censorship, said Gibbs, for we were our own censors. Has that changed, I wonder? In 1917, with millions dead and more recruits needed, the editor of the Manchester Guardian, C.P. Scott, had a private conversation with the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Said Lloyd George, "If people really knew the truth, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't know and can't know."
First World War, it was very common to use a sporting analogy. Going over the top was portrayed as being the start of a rugger match or beginning of a cricket match. There were even stories that the war correspondents wrote of officers who were going over the top, tossing a cricket ball from hand to hand, or leading troops in a charge, kicking a football across no man's land. And that sporting analogy tended to take away the actual horror of the event that was being described. And of course this infuriated the troops to read that they regarded going over the top as a great game and couldn't wait until they were charging down the mouths of the German machine guns, and that their officers were sort of captains of a team that were about to embark on a great game a sporting game with the enemy. It infuriated them because they knew the better analogy would have been them baaing like sheep as they went to the slaughter.
So efficient was the machinery of British propaganda during the First World War, fueled by a policy of total censorship, that according to Phillip Knightley, Dr. Joseph Goebbels based Nazi propaganda in World War II on the British model. During the Second War in Britain, censorship was tight, except for those American correspondents who often painted what one of them called a hearts and flowers picture of all Britons pulling together. This, of course, was true up to a point, but there was another side, such as the efforts of the well-off to send their children abroad, and the support among some MPs for negotiations with Hitler. During the Blitz, money and position could buy you a better place in a better shelter, and those jolly Cockney images of life in the underground were not completely true. The tube became a terrible stinking slum and a health hazard. Not a single British correspondent was at Dunkirk, and yet a romantic version of eyewitness heroics obscured for many years the full story, a story of military incompetence and disaster. The Korean War broke out in 1950 and was described by the journalist James Cameron as a prep school for Vietnam. It was a racist war, and many correspondents were under instructions to play down the suffering of the Korean people.
They are a hardy race and can exist on a much lower sustenance level than white troops.
Instead, the war was reported, by and large, like the World War that had preceded it, as a boy's own annual saga of good versus evil.
Air and ground, we bring you the most dramatic air attack pictures of the war.
Dramatic, yes, but what was the truth about Korea? During the war, Robin C. Miller, an editor of the United Press, said this: "There are certain facts and stories from Korea that editors and publishers have printed which were pure fabrication. Many of us who sent the stories knew they were false, but we had to write them because they were official releases, even though the people responsible knew they were untrue."
New deadly weapon, belly tanks loaded with napalm, also known as jellytol. It's a highly inflammable jelly which is fused and dropped to spray flaming death on enemy foxholes and guerrilla positions.
Napalm was a new American weapon, and Rennie Cutforth of the BBC believed it important to describe its use. "Over this scene of silent desolation," he reported, "crept a reassuring smell that immediately took me back to Sunday dinners in Britain, the smell of roast pork, for that's what a napalmed human being looks like." This dispatch was never used, and the BBC never satisfactorily explained why.
And rockets hiss down with terrifying accuracy onto the Reds below.
These Reds below were so-called political prisoners. They included innocent civilians and children, victims. James Cameron, in Korea for Picture Post with photographer Bert Hardy, witnessed their brutal treatment by Britain's South Korean allies. After a futile protest to United Nations officials, Cameron wrote an article illustrated by Hardy's pictures. "The prisoners are roped and manacled," he reported. "They are compelled to crouch in pools of garbage. They clamber into trucks with the numb air of men going to their death. Many of them are." The Cameron article was on the presses when the proprietor, Edward Hulton, instructed the editor, Tom Hopkinson, to scrap it. Hopkinson refused and was sacked. Cameron resigned in protest. Telling the victim's story, decreed Hulton, would give aid and comfort to the enemy. It might also have given that war a bad name.
Flight, which brought man terror, also gives him life, hastening the wounded back to base.
In the 1950s, few questioned the objectivity of this newsreel style of reporting. But today we look back on it and smile, for it was clearly our propaganda. So how will the news of the Falklands War be regarded in 30 years' time? Or more to the point, why do we have to wait that long to find out?
To the badly wounded, blood from their homeland brings life, replacing the blood they so freely gave that freedom might live.
In contrast with this diet of propaganda, the people of Britain and the United States never knew that the atomic bomb was almost used twice in Korea.
Being bought with lives, a young American said in death, "There must be better ways to settle a dispute." Korea has given his answer. When all the people of the world will it, man will live in peace and die honored in his own bed.
This was Vietnam. In 1967, a Gallup poll revealed that half the American people had no idea what the war in Vietnam was about.
It was the first war that had been covered without censorship of any kind, American war. And it was the first war on television. And for all of us, that was a first, really and truly. in the kind of graphic detail that we were able to provide because of the extraordinary assistance of the Army of the United States. They wanted that coverage. They wanted that relentless coverage. They thought they were going to get something else.
Instead, they got a confusion of images of a war in which progress was measured by something called a body count, or, as in this extraordinary film, an aerial turkey shoot.
Okay, napalm now. There it goes. Ah, look at it burn. Look at it burn. Okay, we got more napalm coming down here. We bombed first of all, and then the napalmers come across, and we strafed immediately in front of them, see, to keep their heads down. We were receiving heavy ground fire. You can see the tracer bullets coming up past us. Fantastic, and we really made them run. That's outstanding, because when they get out of their trenches in the open, we can really hit them, and that's what we like to do. That's what we're here for, and boy, it's outstanding to really catch them out in the open, or we don't do that very often.
It wasn't only the media that invented the image of the Vietnam War, it was the CIA that virtually invented the war. Ralph McGee spent 25 years in the CIA, much of it in Vietnam, and retired with a Medal of Commendation. He is an expert on the CIA's manipulation of the media.
The CIA is not an intelligence agency. The CIA is the covert action arm of the presidency. And in that capacity, it supports or overthrows other governments, and it utilizes the techniques of disinformation as part of its covert action responsibility. And I claim that Vietnam is its longest and most successful disinformation operation. It is not an intelligence agency, it is a covert action agency.
Well, could you explain what disinformation is to the layman, and in particular related to Vietnam?
Disinformation has many, many ways of coming about. You have the techniques of white, gray, and black propaganda. White propaganda being virtually a government statement. This is the U.S. government saying this. Gray propaganda being, well, you don't know quite who's saying it. And black is where you speak in the voice of your enemy. So the Communist Party of China is saying this when actually it's be the agency doing it. Black propaganda, in the case of Vietnam, they have a famous example. In early '65, they wanted justification for sending American troops in to participate in the actual fighting. And they wanted to begin bombing North Vietnam, but the story that was being told to the American people was the war was an invasion of South Vietnam by North Vietnam. But they had to have evidence of this. They only had a couple of North Vietnamese soldiers that they had captured. So they needed some way to document this. So the agency loaded up a North Vietnamese junk with communist weapons. And the agency maintains communist arsenals around the United States and around the world. They loaded the weapons onto the junk. They floated it down off the coast of central South Vietnam. They shot it up, made it look like a firefight had taken place. Then they brought in the American press, the international press, and the International Control Commission, said, here's evidence that the North Vietnamese are invading South Vietnam. Based on this evidence, 2 Marine battalion landing teams went into Vietnam and began actual combat operations. And a week after that, the American Air Force began the regular bombing of North Vietnam, sustained bombing in what they call Operation Rolling Thunder.
Rolling Thunder was reported as a coal statistic. Bridges, trains, and industrial complexes were reported bombed as if Asian Pittsburghs and Birminghams were down below. But an industrial complex was more than likely to be made of straw and contain children. Films such as this seldom appeared on television screens during the war. It is from the other side, North Vietnam, whose moonscape I first saw as if I'd stumbled upon some great and unrecorded disaster. The terror and suffering of these people was seldom reported. They remain simply the communists, the statistic of Rolling Thunder, the body count, their towns and villages marked as industrial complexes on Air Force maps and bombed back to the Stone Age with the craters now merged into swamps. not a single dollar in reparation or aid has helped them to rebuild their homes and lives. A town I saw called Hamlong, just like this village, ought to have been as famous as Dresden because it was bombed much more than Dresden or London, almost every day for 4 years. But few knew about it then and know about it now. Its people were, and are, only victims.
What's the principal illusion that you think everybody is still subscribing to?
That it was an invasion of invasion of South Vietnam by the North Vietnamese. That there was no popular support for the communist government when there certainly was. That whatever government we happened to be backing at the time was the popular government. So that when we sent the American troops in, we were in there to fight for the people, when actually, in fact, we were fighting against the people. Those illusions still exist.
In 1965, American Marines entered the village of Cam Ne and burned it down with Zippo cigarette lighters and flamethrowers. Reporter Morley Safer and a camera crew from America's CBS network were there to record what was one of the first television atrocities.
It was a shock to me. I'd been in battle before, and I'd covered other wars in Vietnam, but I'd heard of this sort of thing going on in the war in Algeria. It went on all the time, but I'd never seen it. Where this simple punishment, as it appeared to me, of a village.
Only 3 or 4 houses had been burned down, said the military. In fact, reporters counted up to 400 houses destroyed. The presence of bunkers, said the military, proved the village was a Viet Cong stronghold. But reporters knew there wasn't a hamlet in Vietnam that didn't have a bunker to protect it, often from American bombing. But even without censorship, it took almost 2 years for the full story of the massacre at My Lai to get out, long after one man, Lieutenant Calley, had been charged with the murder of 102 civilians in March 1968. The reason was not lack of evidence, but a resistance to the story on the part of the media itself. The word atrocity implies something out of the ordinary, but the massacre at My Lai was nothing unusual. The smashing of this home and the dislocation of these lives was also nothing unusual, an everyday atrocity. But unfortunately, refugees, victims, are seldom newsworthy.
It's part of a long historical process in which the civilians have become more and more the target for military hardware. I mean, let's go back to look at the parallels between the Boer War and Vietnam, for example. Just as the Americans tried to do in Vietnam, the British government tried to remove from the Boers, the Boer guerrilla forces, their major source of sustenance, the Boer civilians, by putting all the women and children into concentration camps. So that anybody who was out there in the wilderness still must be a Boer supporter and therefore became a legitimate military target. Much the same thinking of the Americans in Vietnam. Already in the Boer War you begin to get the idea that civilians are legitimate military targets. Second World War, that's continued as a deliberate act of policy. I mean, the British government's or the Allied government's policy in the Second World War was to bomb, area bombing of civilian housing. Now, we denied it at the time. We said we were bombing purely military targets. We were bombing areas of Germany, large civilian populations in German towns, the aim being to break German morale. Then you reach what was probably the ultimate in attacks on civilians. We bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They weren't chosen as targets in which there were large military installations. The principal reason was to break Japanese morale by showing what a large number of your people we can wipe out. So by the time you get to Vietnam, the idea of civilians being killed in war has become acceptable. Large numbers of civilians suffer in war. So it's a natural progression to now we're in the ultimate where the sole target in a nuclear war will be the civilian population. The purpose of dropping nuclear bombs on Russia or the Russians dropping nuclear bombs on the United States is not to wipe out the, part of it's to wipe out the retaliation, the retaliatory capacity, but you're not aiming at their industrial complex or the major military targets, you're aiming at the civilian population. The civilians have now become the major targets.
Considering the likely nature of the next World War, should not the facts about it be reported now? There won't be much chance to debate the rights and wrongs afterwards, and honesty now may help to prevent it. The Vietnam War, which I reported, was often regarded by the American military as a war between cowboys and Indians. It was rampant technology against a peasant people, cluster bombs and chemical bombs against an enemy in rubber tire sandals, and innocent civilians known as gooks or dinks, or by the military term of collateral damage. In most of the news agency offices in Saigon were pictures that were never published or never sent. Pictures of atrocities, the real face of that war, of any war. Protecting your compassion, the most precious thing next to your life, became more and more difficult the longer you stayed, the longer you contrived to remain aloof from the suffering and the criminal stupidity of it all. There is a myth that the media lost the war, but was the war ever winnable? And regardless of the relentless media coverage, why did it take American public opinion 10 years to tire of the war? In 1967, a Newsweek survey found that television actually encouraged people to back up our boys and support the war. 5 years later, during some of the heaviest bombing in history, another survey showed that people had developed a tolerance to all those little pictures of horror and fireworks from far-off Asia. Had they simply merged with the fireworks of Kojak and with the soap operas and the soap commercials? But just as the media did not lose the war, neither, of course, was the war maintained simply by the coverage on television. What was often missing was an attempt to explain the truth, past and present, of what those pictures really meant. An historical perspective was needed, any perspective, other than merely the news of the day. And when the truth finally came out, it was too late. Millions had died, yet again. Millions were maimed and dislocated. A beautiful land ravaged. And the punishment of Vietnam continues. On June the 21st, 1983, the European community decided to block food aid to Vietnam as part of the embargo initiated by the United States. Stockpiles of dried milk have never been higher in Europe. Young children in Vietnam are hungrier now than during the war. Such is the indifference towards Vietnam today.
No one believed in that war. And that's the tragedy, really, of Vietnam, to me, that it was as thought out as the Children's Crusade was thought out. So, well, you look for scapegoats.
Yeah. Perhaps the place to start looking for a credibility gap is not in the offices of the government in Washington, but in the studios of the networks in New York.
In Britain, pressure on the media is less obvious, more subtle.
I think that after Vietnam, in fact, I know that after Vietnam, the British government had a very close look at the effect that the presence of television cameras on the battlefield and that the free reporting, newspaper reporting, of a war could have on the aims of the government in that war. And I think there was a symposium at the Royal United Services Institution in which somebody said, I forget who it was, one of the participants said, we will have to very carefully consider whether it will ever be possible to have television cameras on a battlefield again. This was the lesson they were looking at from Vietnam. And then from that moment on, the MOD had a plan of how they would control the media in any coming war in which Britain would be involved. And that plan was put into operation for the Falklands.
Well, I think the key difference between reporting in the Falklands and certainly all other war situations I've been involved in is that we, the hacks who were down there, were totally prisoners of the Ministry of Defence, in the sense that they controlled our access to the outside world. We had no independent way of contacting our newspapers or radio stations or television stations. Now, that's not normally the situation.
Well, I suppose that the Falklands War was the most managed story in the history of journalism, managed by the people who managed the war. The most extraordinary piece of news management. Hand-picked correspondents, no foreign correspondents, total control of communication, absolute control of communication. I mean, it's a censor's delight. I've spoken to various Vietnam diplomatic and military people during the Falklands War, and they just were green with envy. Oh, if we could have run Vietnam the way the British ran the Falklands. I think they're deluding themselves because Vietnam went on a few more years than the Falklands.
I think the real issue that came out of the Falklands, and indeed I think if you go back and look at Vietnam and Afghanistan, is how do you deal with a sophisticated public? How do you deal with an ever-growing mass of media communications which record things instantly, transmit things instantly? And, you know, what impact is this going to have on a war, both in terms of military security and sustaining popular morale? And the two things actually do go together. Because I don't believe any democracy can win a war unless it has active public support.
Does the current war in Northern Ireland have active public support? The answer would seem to be no. But reporting the undeclared war in Ireland has special pitfalls, especially for television in Britain. For example, the guidelines of the Independent Broadcasting Authority say that any plans for a programme which explores the views of people who within the British Isles advocate violence for political ends must be referred to the authority before filming. However, any programme giving the views of people who use violence outside the British Isles for political ends may go ahead without first consulting the authority. The point is that life is made extremely difficult for a British journalist reporting any British war in Ireland or in the Falklands.
The original idea was there should be no reporters at all with the task force. Total control of access, nobody there at all. And like an American censor said during the Second World War, when asked what should we tell the people, he said, tell them nothing until the war's over, then tell them who won. That was the MOD's original plan. The task force would go down, one day it would be announced that it had been successful and the Falklands were once again under British sovereignty. But under pressure from Downing Street, they modified the plan so as to allow some reporters along. But it was no accident, for example, that there were no neutral reporters. There was no room, not even for one American correspondent. Not one Frenchman. No neutral correspondents at all. 16 to 18 British correspondents only. Nobody was known to be too anti-war, too radical, too against British involvement was allowed. There was no room, for example, for Donald McCullin, one of the most compassionate and best war photographers there are. No room for him because they said they couldn't squeeze it, they couldn't find any accommodation. And as McCullin pointed out, they had room for 3 million Mars bars, so surely they could squeeze one more photographer on board.
The great catch-all that they could use to restrict anything that you said was this phrase, damaging to morale. Now, you could argue that more or less anything could be damaging to morale. There was, for example, when we were sailing down to the Falklands, there was an incident on the Canberra when, after an evening's drinking, a few paras climbed into one of the lifts too many of them got into the lift on the Canberra, pressed the button and the lift broke and it fell 3 or 4 stories through the ship. A couple of the paras were quite seriously injured. We were not allowed to report that because it was felt it would be damaging to morale if it was seen that British troops were getting drunk and were having accidents on a ship. This was before we'd even got to the Falklands.
The Ministry of Defence lost credibility, particularly with foreign correspondents. And there are several examples of major news organisations in the States saying that they put no basis at all on what the British press was saying about the war because they regarded it as a propaganda job. So I think internationally one saw a turnaround of support from being very pro-British to being far more neutral. And certainly Argentine sources came to exercise much more influence than they had done at the beginning.
Offensive land operations are at this moment in progress in the Falkland Islands. You will understand that I cannot at this stage go further.
Well, in the Falklands, Mr. MacDonald, giving a press conference, knew that anything he said with the absolute confidence that no one in the room knew more than he knew, or knew the truth if he was telling a fudge. In Vietnam, the poor old briefer knew that everyone in the room knew more than he knew. So that, because at least those of us who'd been out of Saigon at all, and I would be less than honest if I didn't confess that we used to love to go and tweak the briefers, whether they're the military or the civilian briefers, because if you came back to the story and you were an eyewitness or you spoke to an officer in the field, got the story, filed it, went to the briefing, the so-called 5 o'clock follies, and at that point the only purpose in going was to find out, now that you know what happened, to find out what the government says happened.
The absence of foreign journalists helped to narrow our perspective on what was going on. Probably reporters from any country are peculiarly involved in a war which is affecting their own country or their own countrymen. But obviously the presence of foreign journalists would help to give you a wider view of it. I think it would have made things a lot more difficult. I don't think that any of the American reporters I've ever come across would have put up with half of the nonsense that we put up with. They simply wouldn't have tolerated it.
Usually one guarantee of keeping a balance of reporting in a war is having reporters from other countries there. Why weren't there no foreign journalists with the task force?
With hindsight, I wish we had one or two, although, as I said to the Select Committee, I think we, curious enough, had too many journalists on the task force to handle as well as we ought to have been able to do.
Did the number of journalists matter? Or wasn't it more important that as wide a spread of views as possible be represented on the task force and at the front line? To represent, for example, the substantial minority of the public who had serious misgivings about the war.
I think we all, to varying degrees, had a sort of love affair with the military. We all became troopy groupies. That's the phrase that's been used, and I think it's quite true. And it did affect our reporting, there's no doubt about that. It certainly affected mine, and I would not pretend that it didn't. But it was a very, very peculiar situation. You had a group of reporters, by and large, who were not experienced war correspondents, who were pretty run-of-the-mill Fleet Street reporters, and I include myself in that category, who were pitched off on this peculiarly sort of wild colonial expedition. I mean, kind of bizarre thing to be happening in the 1980s, really. And inevitably we became friends. We drank together in the bars, we started doing physical exercises together, we became interested in their life, they became interested in ours, and by the time we landed we were quite good friends.
All right, 2 there.
By this stage, we've controlled access, the MOD's controlled access to the war. They know what sort of reporters they're going to send, and they've got a fairly good idea that they can rely on those reporters' sense of identification with the troops to self-censor, to censor themselves. So you've got the 3 main elements tied up before the fighting even begins.
I think there was a feeling that a war fought in the 1980s with modern technology would be vastly different in the way it would be covered to any other war. And what one actually found was that television played very little part in actually covering the fighting. We saw virtually no pictures of fighting on the screens until the war was all but won. And I think the best analogy with the Crimea is to say that at the time of the Crimea, Russell's first dispatch about the charge of the Light Brigade got back to London in 20 days, and some television pictures took 23 days to get back from the South Atlantic.
Well, I think the Falklands was peculiar in the sense that the lack of television coverage, except on a delayed basis. Now, that was for technical reason. It wasn't a prevention. And it is an absolute canard that people tried to stop television. It just didn't happen. And a lot of this was, if I may say so, whipped up by the television people, because radio came back into its own again during that period of time.
If they had wanted to, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that they could have given us independent communication system, if they had wanted to. I say this because the SAS, for example, had their own independent network. They had a number of small satellite dishes, which they carried in ordinary backpacks. And the way they operated was basically they poached time on American satellites flying overhead. And they could relay messages back to their headquarters in Hereford. Indeed, there's at least one occasion on which one of the commanding officers in the SAS was telephoned his wife in Hereford. It could have been done. This stuff is expensive. It may have not have been the Ministry of Defence's job to have supplied it to us, but the equipment was there, the technical equipment is there, if they had wanted to supply it to us or to tell us that we could go and get it.
All these stories about we have not got the technical facilities to enable instantaneous transmission of television footage from the battlefield, all untrue. The satellites were there, the time was there, they could have sent back to London within hours of it occurring, perhaps within minutes. They could have, I think it may have even been technically possible to have transmitted live from the battlefield. It wasn't done. Not because of any reasons of giving away information to the enemy, not for any reasons of being technically difficult, because they knew that material sent live from the battlefield would show scenes of two groups of men doing some very nasty things to each other on a faraway South Atlantic island, and the scenes of the horror and the ghastliness of war would remove the will of the nation to continue fighting it.
These news pictures are among the closest the British public got to seeing the ghastliness of the war. They were delayed 16 days. The pictures show no ghastly burns, no ghastly blown away arms and legs.
They lent heavily on the broadcasters to try and sanitize the image of the war. Particular examples spring to mind. The British government asked the BBC not to show a picture of a body in a bag. It asked a reporter not to use the phrase horribly burned. It tried to prevent the broadcasters from showing a pilot who'd bombed the runway at Port Stanley, saying that he was scared fartless when he was doing it. When Brian Hanrahan reported on the casualties at Bluff Cove, he reported of hearing the cries of men trapped below, dying in the flames. The Ministry of Defence asked for that line to be cut. So I think there was a tendency to look back to Vietnam and to use it and to think we must not let war be seen in that light on British screens, and I think they succeeded.
I had one experience myself, which I didn't write about until the war was over, which was on the first Saturday after the landings, a week after the landings. By chance, I helped to unload the bodies of dead paratroopers who'd come back from Goose Green. Now, we'd all been told that there would be body bags for these men, and it would all be neat and clean and tidy. And none of these blokes had got body bags. They were in an appalling state. I mean, they were just bodies with limbs all over the place. Shirts pulled over their heads to disguise them, blood and muck and filth, and it was just horrible. I mean, it was just absolutely awful, absolutely horrific. And I wrote about that when the war was over. I didn't write about it at the time. Perhaps I should have done.
Why didn't you?
I think I didn't feel it was fair, somehow. I just didn't feel it was fair. I mean, that's a testimony to how involved I was with those blokes by that stage. but I somehow didn't feel they deserved it. It wasn't about whether we were going to win or that you only had to report good things. It was an emotional thing. You know, I mean, I've seen plenty of dead bodies before. You don't get normally that involved with them, but I mean, I actually knew some of those people. I mean, it affects you. I mean, we'd spent 2 months with them. I mean, really closely with them by that stage. I mean, it was just, I just didn't think it was fair.
I think what pointed up the Falklands War was the fact that in its closing stages, one had the Israeli attack on the Lebanon. One had censorship of pictures, the way the journalists could cover it. And the journalists made a point, particularly the American journalists, of telling the public that they couldn't report the whole story. And something which had a sensational impact on American television was that news film which had been censored, they'd leave black spacing in and say these pictures have been censored, and would say we are operating under conditions of censorship. Some British correspondents were doing the same from the Lebanon, but no British correspondents were doing that from the task force. Some of them tried. The PA reporter tried to say this copy is being censored, and the word censored was censored.
There was no great stamp which said censored, not to be used, on the copy. There were gentle, diplomatic little notes saying editors are requested not to use this information because it could be of use to an enemy, and please omit this if at all possible. And it was all terribly, terribly gentlemanly in its style. You felt that the whole thing was really being sorted out in a rather convivial club.
And was it sorted out? Would an editor, by and large, take note of those little remarks?
I have not come across any examples where any editors in Fleet Street did not do what they were asked to do by the Ministry of Defence. When we were at Teal Inlet, we were held up. The advance on Port Stanley was held up principally by the weather conditions. Because there was such a low cloud base and because the rain was so heavy, helicopters couldn't fly troops and supplies forward to Mount Kent, from which the military intended to attack Port Stanley. And I wrote a story basically about the weather. I wrote about 1,000 words just about the weather and how the weather was holding us up. And the key sentence in the piece was that only the weather now holds us back from Stanley. When this dispatch reached London, it had been changed into only the politicians now hold us back from Stanley.
What are you going to do with dissent at home? Well, that turned out to be very easy. In the name of patriotism, you call upon the nation to get behind our effort. You do that probably through a statement by the Prime Minister, and that atmosphere is immediately picked up by those newspapers who either felt that the war was a just one and it should be fought the way it was being fought, or who saw an opportunity to consolidate their circulation, perhaps improve it, by adopting an attitude of fierce, patriotic endeavour. And that pressure tended to suppress any dissent. So with a brilliantly controlled operation that doesn't look to be censorship, you've got total control over what is reported about the war.
Well, I think there was a period for a short time at the beginning of the Falklands when at least some parts of the media were setting themselves up, or appearing to set themselves up, as an impartial referee. And, you know, the same degree of credibility was being given to the Argentine as was being given to the British.
Isn't that the role of the press, to be impartial?
It's a new one on me, if it's so. I mean, I'm sure it's part of press ethics. I doubt very much whether it has ever been impartial. Everybody's biased. I'm biased, you're biased. And I just don't believe in this great piece of objectivity and you know, lack of bias. We all have emotions, we all have feelings, we all have attitudes.
Sir Frank is right. We all have our biases. The problem seems to be that the moment journalists run seriously against the grain of established thinking, as represented by the government and the Ministry of Defence, they are accused of not being objective, as if objectivity is all right only as long as it is part of the official line. This, of course, applies in both war and peace. Perhaps a truly objective appraisal of Bluff Cove, where 50 men died like sitting ducks, would not have been to allow the bravery and heroism of the men to obscure the fact of a blunder and a disaster.
The self-censorship of both editors at home and correspondents at the front not to tell the truth about the horrible way in which men die, and using as an excuse for not doing that the sparing of the feelings of relatives back home again, takes away from war the real horror of it, and in its with all good intentions prepares us for the next war. Because if it's not so bad, if it's not so horrific, if you're never told, people who've never been to war are not told what it's like, then they're more willing to embark on the next war than they would have been if they'd known what really occurred.